Both the left and the right followed with great interest the presidential elections in Austria between the far-left eco-Marxist allegedly independent Alexander van der Bellen and the allegedly far-right candidate of the FPÖ, Mr. Norbert Hofer. The result, with the far-left eco-Marxist narrowly winning, spawned further discussions both on the far-left and on the far-right, particularly amongst dissenters of the two, namely the leftists who agree with Hofer on immigration and the rightists who agree with van der Bellen on other foreign policy issues, such as van der Bellen's position on Russian aggression. Oh boy, this is going to be complicated. So, let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, first of all, I would recommend you do watch this interview with the young Austrian man in order to get a slightly better understanding about the minutiae of Austrian politics. Now, the interview was made just before the elections, so it does cover a lot of aspects relevant to the topic at hand that I won't repeat here or I'll merely gloss over. Alright, with that out of the way, let's first lay out the facts, which are few and clear. After counting the direct votes, FPÖ's candidate had 51.9% of the votes casted and was roughly 194,000 of votes ahead of the Green candidate. However, Austria also allows postal voting, i.e. citizens mailing their ballots from wherever they are in the world, and that still counts. Now, after counting the mailing votes as well and adding them up to the total, the Green candidate had roughly 31,000 votes ahead of the FPÖ's candidate and was thus declared the winner with just 0.6% of the votes more than the opponent, making the victory of an environmentalist activist for the first time in the presidency also one of the tightest races in recent memory. Now, as expected, the average voter for the FPÖ's candidate was a man working in a manual labor job. You know, the people who make a country work. The average voter for the Green candidate was a woman working in a white-collar profession. Another fact that one needs to bear in mind is that the power of the Austrian president is quite limited. Other than having the power to dissolve the National Council, the president in Austria is basically a decorative element. It's not like in France, where the president actually does matter in most of the cases. Now, it is true that the dissolution of the National Council can trigger general elections. The president can only do that once in a term and only for very few reasons that are quite, tightly defined. Okay, so these are the basic facts that one needs to bear in mind throughout the rest of this video. Now on to the controversies. Oh boy, this can be good. So let me try to be as short as possible. The first controversy is the never-ending suspicion of fraud. The argument for this goes something like this. The postal vote accounted for 17% of the total votes cast, or 746,222 to be more precise. The direct votes accounted for the rest of the 83% of the total votes cast, or 3,731,720. Now, in order for the FPÖ's candidate to lose, the postal votes would have to be at least 60% in favor of the Green candidate, which they were, if we are to believe the Interior Minister's office, which says that the FPÖ's candidate got only 38.27% of the postal vote. This is allegedly too much of a difference between the direct vote and the postal vote, and this could not have happened without fraud. Now, I'm not buying that at all. And I'm not buying it for exactly two reasons. One is that there is no substantive evidence of any kind that fraud has indeed occurred. With great sadness, even FPÖ's activists who have assisted both the voting and the counting process conceded that the process was very fair. And two, this is not the first nor the last time when the expat vote, because that's usually the postal vote, differs quite a lot from the direct vote and sometimes decisively changes the result of the vote. And let me give you two recent examples. Now, the first one is the 2014 Romanian presidential elections. Now, Romania doesn't have a postal vote, but it has numerous polling stations located abroad in virtually every locality where there is a decent diaspora presence. Now, after counting the internal vote, the Social Democrat candidate had a slight edge in the second round. But after the diaspora votes were also counted, the result radically changed and the candidate from the National Liberal Party was declared the winner, as he won the diaspora vote with exactly 89.73%. That was more than enough to move him towards a 54% overall winning score. Second example, the Irish referendum on gay marriage. Now, just like Romania, Ireland doesn't have postal vote, and to make things worse, Ireland did not set up polling stations abroad at all. So the diaspora organized itself, and thousands upon thousands of Irishmen and women flew back home just so they can vote in that particular referendum. Now, if I am to believe the Irish Times, at least 72,000 people came to Ireland exclusively to vote in that referendum. In reality, they were probably more like 150,000, since a significant chunk of Irish immigrants live in the United Kingdom and can't really be counted whenever they come back home. Anyway, virtually all of those who came back to vote were on the yes side of that referendum. Now, it just so happens that in this case their travel did not directly influence the results, but it did make the yes side's victory appear much wider than it actually was, since it is simply not true that 2 in 3 Irishmen living in Ireland, or even 2 in 3 residents of Ireland, actually support gay marriage. Also, this move indirectly influenced the final results, perhaps even decisively, by galvanizing the yes fans even further. So, basically, what I try to say here is that it is not uncommon at all for the diaspora to have a disproportionately different preference than the voters who actually live in that particular nation. Now, I'm not saying that the diasporas are wrong or correct, but I am saying that the disproportionate support for the Green candidate in this Austrian election is not and cannot be in itself evidence or even an indicator that something nefarious occurred during the electoral process. Now, another argument in favor of the fraud hypothesis is the example of the small town of Veithofen an der Ybbs, in which the turnout was reportedly 146.9%. Now, it is unclear whether that was a mistake in reporting or that was indeed the turnout. But let's assume it was not a mistake. That still doesn't mean too much, although it is a better argument than the previous one. But in all fairness, it is not an uncommon phenomenon in small localities, and really not uncommon at all in elections in general. For instance, Madison, Wisconsin recorded a 119 turnout in the recalled gubernatorial election in June of 2012. This was, of course, 119% of the registered voters, i.e. many individuals registered on the spot and voted then, perhaps for the first time. Now, such instances do tend to lead to these kinds of numbers. Now, if someone can come up with lots of such examples, then I'd be very happy to reconsider this argument. You know, when in Russia the national turnout was recorded as 107%, that was a far stronger indicator of fraud, because it simply is not possible for so many people to be simultaneously Russian and be outside of the electoral lists in order to drive up the entire country's voter turnout stats to over 100%. Now that is a statistical impossibility. However, over 100% turnout here and there in a few isolated cases, that's not only perfectly possible, but very, very common in any election that involves multiple small communities. Now, the second controversy that needs to be cleared is the alleged far-right position of either the FPO or Mr. Hofers himself. Now, this is basically a flat-out lie by the media. Mr. Hofer is ideologically inconsistent at best or a sleazy infiltrator at worst. For instance, whilst claiming to be a man of the right, he also sees himself to the left of the US Democratic Party. And that statement is less than 6 months old. And it shows his economic positions are rather from the Bernie Sanders loony asylum than from Margaret Thatcher. Now, speaking of Margaret Thatcher, while he says he's to the left of the Democrats, he also says he's a fan of Margaret Thatcher. Now, if one wants to be charitable, one could conclude that maybe he's a fan of Mrs. Thatcher for her social positions, such as opposition to the European Union, her rejection of LGBT propaganda in schools, and other such things. I, however, am slightly less charitable and simply view Mr. Hofer as a classical archetype of candidate that emerges whenever the mainstream political class becomes insane. Now, Mr. Hofer may genuinely be ideologically confused or may genuinely hold conflicting opinions. In reality, that's completely irrelevant. What is of relevance, both for the rightists who dislike him and for the leftists who dislike him, is the fact that Mr. Hofer is not the problem, but rather the result of the problem. And the problem is, of course, mass Islamic immigration. The second problem, after mass Islamic immigration, is the audacity of the far left to flat out lie about the Austrian population by calling them all sorts of despicable names just because they think Austria should primarily be about Austrians. Now, I know, radical thought indeed. The left has been calling anyone who disagrees with them on immigration a Nazi, a fascist, a criminal, and so on and so forth. This cannot go forever, and will not go forever. As I said, the president's office is mostly decorative, but with millions of Austrians willing to vote for this guy in spite of all the name-calling, the shenanigans, and the toxic climate of the left, one would have to be a fool not to expect a further rise of the Austrian Freedom Party. And mind you, I'm not saying this with any trace of joy. I'm not thrilled about FPO at all because of their cushy relationship with the Kremlin. Same deal as with National Front in France, really. But it's not the FPO's voters' fault that the FPO is the only voice against the establishment's consensus to fill Austria with economic migrants who do ruin the country economically by abusing its welfare system and by decreasing the safety on the streets. If you're genuinely concerned about immigration and you don't like the baggage that comes with the FPO, then it is your duty to be part of the alternative. It's easy to stay in the armchair and say, well, the FPO sucks because they sucked in the past too and they have proven corruption in their track record and are Putinist shills. Yeah, the FPO is all of these. But what's the average Austrian voter supposed to do? Keep on voting for more of the same? And for how long? How many chances does the crooked establishment have to get until it gets things that matter right? Because this might be the last chance. Whether you like the FPO or not, the next legislative elections are very likely to be won by the FPO. Every single poll made in 2016, and there have been 15 major polls so far, gives the FPO as the winner by quite a significant margin for a multi-party parliamentary system. If snap elections are avoided somehow, the establishment has around 2 years to prove that it is not completely insane, namely that you can have a sane immigration policy without demagoguery, that you can have a sane foreign policy whilst maintaining sound economic policies at home, as opposed to the Social Democrats and the Greens, who tend to be correct on foreign policy but completely and utterly wrong on economics. And that you can have a sane economic policy without having to elect, fans of Thatcher who are to the left of Obama. Hofer's words, not mine. Now, will the establishment live up to this task? Of course not. With the radical environmentalist as president, they'll have no incentive to start living up to the actual expectations of the actual people of Austria. If anything, a win of Mr. Hofer would have incentivized the establishment a lot more, even if out of fear that he might call for snap elections. Again, I really do hope I'll be proven wrong, but I suspect I will not be proven wrong. Because even if there's anything because if there is anything one can bet almost entirely safe when it comes to politicians, is a bet on the politician's stupidity, self-absorbance, and cretinism. You see, most politicians are not Margaret Thatcher. Most politicians are Bernie Sanders, especially in Europe. Alright, that's enough for now. So, to sum up, it is highly unlikely that the vote was subjected to fraud. But if compelling evidence emerges in that regard, I will change my position. But for now, the evidence is not thin, but entirely non-existent. What matters a lot more is what happens from now on. Should the establishment wake up, even if very slowly, then it will be great. But nobody should count on that. What's more likely to happen is for the establishment to be busy debating transgender toilets whilst the youth diversity rapes children in broad daylight. And that will be a disaster. Again, the FPO's bizarre views and stances are irrelevant. The FPO's rising, as troubling as many may think it is merely a symptom. And with that being said, thank you for watching and thank you for supporting this channel. Talk to you soon on Freedom Alternative.